Hello and welcome, and today I want to be going over a couple of the updates that have taken place with Thrall over the last couple of weeks. So recently I have made quite a few changes to Thrall, and I'd like to showcase them today. The changes that have been made mostly relate to the skill trees with three particular characters, in this case Lionel, Damien, and Brutus. Now, one of the problems I was feeling that I had with Thrall, and one of the reasons why I feel like development has kind of slowed down a little bit, I was starting to feel a little bit burnt out, and I think part of that was because the game was starting to feel a little bit stale, especially in regards to its combat. Just for a little bit of reference, what combat used to be prior to this update is that everybody had one action skill that they could use, with the exception of Mel, who had three. She has three elemental spells, but Lionel had I don't have it unlocked right now, but Lionel had a self-healing regen buff that could then be expanded to increase his accuracy, his evasion, grant him some thorns damage, and you could do other things with it, like it would allow him to instantly restore health instead of just regenerating health, and then as a capstone ability he could actually use that to target any given ally and give them those buffs instead. Brutus was sort of similar, where he had another self-buff that put him into an auto-battle state, where you lost all control of him, but it would give him a significant damage and dexterity increase, which would increase his ATB gauge faster, and obviously make him deal more damage. And then there was ways you could expand on that, where it would give him bonus thorns damage, it would give him increased defense. There was a skill that made it so that it's an auto-life skill, so that while he's in that state, if he dies, he'll instantly be revived. And then, of course, his capstone for that allowed him to enter that state while retaining control of actions, so it takes away the penalty of the auto-battle portion of that state. And then Damien had an interesting ability where it concealed him from enemies, so it took him out of the targeting priority altogether, so that if enemies were going to target an ally, they could not target him even if he was the only person standing. Like, if they tried to target him, the attack would simply fail. And if he was the only person standing, enemies would literally just stand there and not do anything because they had nobody to target. But that would end as soon as Damien attacked. And then there were ways that you could expand on that skill by giving him things like lifesteal while that skill was active. You could increase the damage he deals while he's in that state. He's got a great skill with overkill, where if he deals damage and kills an enemy while in that state, any damage that he deals past what would normally be required to kill that enemy is stored as overkill, and then his following attack would deal that overkill to the next enemy. And then his capstone with that ability would allow him to instantly recharge the ability, and allow him to reapply it on his next turn, so he can basically stay in that state perpetually with very, very little downtime. Those skills I feel like were all really good, and I haven't removed them. But that was about all there was for combat for these characters. With the exception of those few action skills, basically you could attack, you could use a weapon skill based on whatever weapon you had equipped at the time, you could enter cover, which would allow you to restore a little bit of HP over turn and remove you from the targeting priority as long as there is at least one ally standing that you can take cover behind. So you cannot have two allies in cover, for example, and if both allies are down, there's nothing for you to take cover behind, so you are stuck not being in cover, but it does give you a bit of a defensive option. And then, of course, yeah, your action skills. And then if you charge up your attack enough, your overdrive gauge at the bottom in between the health and ATB gauges, once that is full, would give you access to some new and powerful skills, whether it's a weapon-based overdrive skill or a class-based overdrive skill. And then, of course, you could just use whatever items you have on hand. But that was about it. That was about the extent of what you could do in combat, and once you used one of your action skills and it goes on cooldown, it would usually be on cooldown for 15 turns, and during that time your options in combat are extremely limited. So, I've made some changes to skill trees. First off, let's go over one particular change. There was a skill that Lionel, the person who's being targeted right now, specifically had in the center of his left skill tree, which allowed him to change weapons in battle without spending a turn. Now, changing weapons in battle is something that anybody could do, but it would end their turn to do so. Now, because this game relies heavily on a randomized loot system, where all the weapons and armors you find are going to be drastically different. Some of them will have elements, some of them will have different unique abilities, some of them will deal increased crit damage or cause knockback, some of them provide different weapon skills, like for example the spear you get drive, and then the sword you get flurry. Because of the diversity in the types of weapons you can equip, I wanted to make sure everybody could equip a weapon, but I feel like spending a turn to do so was a little bit punishing, especially if, let's say, you're facing a fire enemy and you've got a fire weapon equipped. Well, rather than spending an entire turn just to switch your weapon, I've made it now so that everybody, regardless of what skills they have unlocked, can switch weapons freely. And it does not cost a turn to do so. So now with that, it gives every character a few more options for what they can do in combat, so that you can strategize as to not just what you're going to attack, but what you're going to attack them with. But that's not all. I have also completely revised the skill trees for these 3 characters in particular, and I'm going to show you what that is like. So, as I mentioned before, Mel, the 4th party member, again, with Thrall you basically choose 3 party members that you want to carry through with the story, and you leave 1 behind, and whichever one you leave behind will change how the story progresses. I've left Mel behind for this playthrough just because I wanted to test how these 3 characters are going to work, but Mel's skill trees are largely unchanged. She has 3 action skills, a fire, ice, and lightning spell, and those 3 spells, basically she's the only character in the game that has spells that can deal elemental damage and make use of enemy elemental weaknesses. These 3, however, instead of just a self-buff skill, they have now been given a secondary action skill as well, with a skill tree that actually relates specifically to that skill. So I'm going to go over a few of the changes here. I'm not going to go hugely into depth. If you want to kind of get a better idea of what each of these skill trees do, you'll be able to download the demo. I'm looking at updating it soon, not yet. This is not available on itch yet at the time of recording this video, but it will be available soon. I'm looking to hopefully get a full proper update out by the end of October, possibly November. Depends on how things go with scheduling. But let's go into this. So Lionel previously had his aura ability, which allowed him to get regen for 15 turns, and it had a 15-turn cooldown. And then his center tree is basically unchanged. He still gets the increased bonuses to aura, such as the increased regen, accuracy, evasion, instant health restoration, targeting a chosen ally, but there's a few skills from his right tree that have now been merged into his left, particularly Radiant. This used to be a capstone ability on the far right tree. It is now just a tier 5 skill within his center tree, so this grants half of his HP regen to all his allies as well. Now, one other thing you might be noticing right away is that there is another change that I've made to the skill trees universally, and that is that I have highlighted the center and bottom skills of every tree with just a little colorful border. So the center trees have like a light silver border, and the bottom skills have a light gold border. And the reason for that is that I do not want players to get overwhelmed when they are starting a new file. If you start a new file and you don't know what to expect and you don't understand the skill trees, and you open up your character skill trees to see not just one set of 3 branching skill trees with 30 skills, but 4 of them, 1 for each character, that can be very overwhelming. So the purpose of highlighting those skills is for a player to not get overwhelmed and instead say, okay, here's their action skills. What are the key important skills that I want to pay attention to? Oh, let's look at the ones that are highlighted. These are the center skills. These are ones that I can go for relatively early. These are the capstone abilities. These are the skills I'm going to want to go for in the long term. So I've highlighted it to make it a little bit more clear, just give it a little bit more visual clarity to help prevent the player from being overwhelmed. But regardless, that is largely the... so that is Lionel's center tree. Not much has changed there. His left tree has actually gone through some significant changes, though. His left tree was mainly split between sword and blunt weapon proficiencies. I have trimmed that down, and I've merged some of the abilities from his old far right tree into this tree here. So it still is focused on the split between sword and blunt weapons. However, his center skill was the ability that allowed him to switch weapons in combat without spending a turn. That's been removed and has just been given to every character by default, and now his mercy ability from his far right tree has been put into the left tree, where killing an enemy with a weapon skill will immobilize instead of killing them. This allows Lionel to disable enemies, essentially removing them from combat without actually killing them, and allowing other characters to set up their own kill skills, the abilities that they get when they kill an enemy. In addition, this actually has some unique applications in situations where you're in fights with regenerating enemies that respawn. By immobilizing them, you not only take them out of the battle, but you prevent them from respawning. So Mercy has some interesting applications that are really kind of fun to look into. Now, the other skills at the bottom half of this tree, again, I have kept his weapon swapping abilities where he gains lifesteal or bonus accuracy after switching a weapon, because I do feel that Lionel, being the soldier, would have more proficiency with multiple weapons, so it feels like it makes sense to keep those abilities with him, even if anybody can switch weapons for free regardless. However, I did remove the bottom tier abilities that focused specifically on swords and blunt weapons. I replaced one of the ones up in the tier 2 tree for the blunt weapon because it just didn't really feel very effective. And I have now replaced these skills with mercy skills, so after he uses his mercy ability, he gains bonus evasion, bonus thorns damage, and then I have made regret his increased damage after using mercy a capstone ability, but I have raised the damage increase from 30% to an increase of 50%. So that is the changes to his left tree, but let's get into the fun stuff. His right tree has gone through some significant changes. So now, instead of just having Aura as his one action skill that gives him regen, he now has Shine. Shine is a non-elemental damaging spell. It deals quote-unquote light damage, but light isn't really an element. That's more relating to late endgame stuff. I don't really want to spoil too much there, but that will make sense as you play through the game later. Now, Shine deals non-elemental damage to one target with a cooldown of 15 turns. This is the same as Mel's Fire, Ice, and Shock Burst, where the damage is based on the damage stat of the user's equipped weapon. It has perfect accuracy and it ignores enemy defense. The difference between Shine and Fire, Ice, and Shock Burst is that Shine does not deal any elemental bonuses, damage bonuses to enemies that have elemental weaknesses, nor does it afflict any status ailments. So his focus is not that of being a mage, but it is still a way that it gives him an additional optional action skill and an attack that he can use in battle. So instead of simply having Aura, he can now use Shine and deal damage with a simple non-elemental spell. Now his right tree has been completely overhauled to make good use of Shine. So I've kept a few skills such as Healthy, Hardened, and Empathy. I've kind of moved some things around to make things work there. However, let's get into his Shine skill. So for example, now he has Holy. Holy grants increased damage with Shine against vampires and minions, a rather significant bonus of 40%. Most of the damage increases for a tier 1 action skill is only 20%, but because this is a very narrow scope, really only relating to minions of vampires and vampires themselves, it's a bit of a higher increase at 40%. We've also got things like where now he has lifesteal with Shine. His center skill actually is very unique. It gives a unique status effect that can only be applied with Shine, but it's a very short duration. Essentially what it does is it will blind enemies, causing them to miss all of their physical attacks. It will apply every single time to any common enemy, but bosses have a 40% chance to resist it. However, regardless of whether it's applied or not, it only lasts 5 turns, so it's not super overpowered, but it does definitely help for a short duration. The other thing that it does is we've got Sunlight. Now Shine can inflict burn status. It does not change it to a fire element, but it does give it a bonus status ailment. We also have, now these two, I'm actually really happy with how this worked out, Renewal and Divinity. So Renewal means that when you use Aura, his other action skill, that causes him to regenerate HP, it will immediately reset the cooldown of Shine. So if you use Shine first and set it on cooldown, and then you use Aura, Shine will immediately be restored and you can use it again. In addition to that, we have Divinity, where if Aura is active, Shine will gain 20% increased damage as well. And then finally his capstone ability, Revealing, lets Shine target all enemies, but the cooldown for Shine will be increased for every target hit. So that's Lionel. I feel like that gives him a lot more just diversity in combat. He's not just stuck between attacking, covering, and using aura. He now has this spell as well that allows him to kind of strategically target different enemies and do things in a little bit more. It gives him more offensive options than simply attacking and weapon skills. So that's Lionel. Let's get into, actually, let's go with Damien next. Damien's been a lot of fun to work on. Damien is sort of like our stealth-based character. So he's a rogue assassin type. Damien, I was actually really happy with his center tree. I only made a few changes. I moved Thirst from his left tree into the center tree here, because I wanted to keep some kill skills, and this was a good skill that I felt fit in this tree. I also moved Aggression and Bloody into this tree. I moved Fast Hands down one tier and Camouflage over into this side of the tree. So Aggression and Bloody used to be in the far right tree here. They are now in the center tree. So his Stalker tree is really focused on improving the ability of stalking, that ability that lets him conceal himself from enemies and basically give him a sneak attack. In his left tree, however, we have merged, once again, we've merged his left and right trees. So his left tree used to be focused on knife proficiency, and that was about it, and it still is. So we've kept Knife Man. I've moved Deep Wounds from, I believe it was here, down to a tier 2 skill. It's actually quite limited in its applications compared to other equally useful skills from other characters, so I felt it was worth downgrading it to a tier 2 skill. And of course we've kept Poison Blade, granting weak status with all knives. Now this is where things change a little bit. I changed Contagious to Infectious. It's just a name change, and I'll get into why that is in a second here. So Infectious allows critical hits with knives to always apply weak status, even if the enemy is immune to it. But now I've also merged his right tree, which was focused on critical hits, with his left tree, which is focused on knives. So we've got Deadly in this tree now, as well as Acclamation. We have Sneak Attack and Killing Blow all in this tree as well. And now Killer. Killer used to be the, I believe it was the mid-tier skill. Yes, it was the middle of the tree skill on his far right side, which increases his critical hit damage by 100% after killing an enemy. This is now in his rogue tree. Now this synergizes with his overkill ability from his center tree, which is why I didn't want to get rid of it, but it didn't fit in his right tree anymore. So I've moved Killer here. And because of how useful it is, I did increase it from a mid-tier skill to a tier 5 skill. However, his capstone ability has changed. It used to be, with Lethal, that you would deal increased damage to weak afflicted foes. Here's the thing about that. That's kind of boring, because weak afflicted foes already take bonus damage from subsequent attacks. All it did was increase the damage. Now, you get increased crit chance against weak afflicted foes by 20%. So if you inflict weak status to an enemy and then you attack that enemy again with Damien, he will get a 20% increased crit chance. I think that's much more interesting, much more exciting. It synergizes much nicer with his abilities such as Killer, and really makes a focus on knives, weak status, and crits with this tree. Now, that's his center and left trees, but let's go into the new stuff. So once again, instead of just having Stalking, which is the self buff that gives Damien sort of like a sneak attack, now we have, Poison. Poison is a skill that's brand new to Damien. It is similar to Lionel's Shine ability, where it inflicts non-elemental damage, but in this case it also inflicts weak status to one target. Now weak status increases all subsequent damage to the afflicted by 50%. And again, it's based on the damage side of the user's equipped weapon, has perfect accuracy, and ignores enemy defenses, just like Mel's Bursts or Lionel's Shine. Now, a quote-unquote spell that also inflicts weak status is pretty powerful on its own, but his right tree focuses on making it even better. Now, the only skill I'm thinking about still maybe changing is this one here, Viral, where it reduces the cooldown of poison at the time of activation. I wanted to make it so that it reduces the cooldown when applying weak status, but I had some difficulty getting that to work because technically it doesn't actually go on cooldown until after the skill processing has completed, and weak status is applied before the skill processing is completed. So I did this as a placeholder. I may change this. Further down, though, we've got Compromised, where it grants increased damage with poison against weak afflicted enemies, again by 40% as compared to the usual 20%, because it is a little bit limited in its scope. We have Silent. Now, Silent is a lot of fun. So normally, here, let's do this. Normally, when Damien goes into stalking, he will be concealed from enemies until his next attack. As soon as he attacks, he is revealed. That also applies to when he uses any skill, including poison. So he will be revealed as soon as he uses his next action. Silent changes this. And now, you can use poison while stalking is active without ending stalking. So this is a way for Damien to apply weak status and deal a little bit of damage without actually ending his stealth mode, which allows him to set up for his next attack. So now that we're in stalking, we can use poison, and stalking will persist. Damien will still be concealed. And then his next attack, as long as it hits, will hit. It will deal the increased damage against the weak afflicted foe, and now he's revealed. In addition to that, we've got a few other skills here. I kept Spoils, but I moved it down because I did feel it was a little bit more powerful. Disease. Poison can now score a critical hit. So whatever Damien's critical hit chance is with his weapon, that is now applied to his poison spell as well. So when he gets a critical hit, he will deal any critical hit damage bonuses that poison actually, that his weapon would normally inflict, as long as it is not weapon specific. And he will get any critical hit chances that his weapon would inflict as long as it is not specific to a certain skill, such as his throw ability with knives, which grants an increased chance for that attack. Further down, we've got Oblivious. Using poison while stalking is active will always apply weak status. So this synergizes quite nicely with Silent. If you enter into stalking and you use poison, you will always, 100% of the time, inflict weak status with that skill. And then Contagious. This is why I renamed Infectious. This used to be called Contagious. It is now called Infectious because Contagious, I felt, was a better skill name for this, where if you apply weak status with poison to one enemy, it will randomly apply it to another enemy as well. Now, it's not guaranteed, because it may actually pick the same enemy that you targeted. It just randomly selects an enemy from the troop and applies poison to it if you successfully apply poison to one. But there you go. As you can see, we applied to one, and a random second enemy got applied with it as well. And then finally, for Damien's capstone ability, we have Toxic. Poison will hit twice with slightly reduced base damage. So it doesn't double the damage. The base damage goes down by 25%. And all damage calculations are calculated off the new base damage. However, every single hit has a chance to apply a weak status, and if you apply it on the first hit, the subsequent hit will take bonus damage. There we go. So that is Damien. That, I feel like, gives him a lot more combat options, especially when you consider that stalking really didn't give him very much to do. It concealed him for a turn and gave him increased damage, but that's about all it did. With this, stalking is also much more useful, and even without stalking, poison is much more useful as well. It gives him an additional combat option that is not simply attacking or a weapon skill. Okay, so those are Damien and Lionel's skill trees. Now let's get into the final one, Brutus. Brutus was fun. I feel like I may have made him a little bit overpowered, though, and I may need to nerf some of his skills. I'm going to be working on balancing a lot more later on in development. But Brutus has some very fun skills as well. So normally, his original action skill was Rage, which put him into an auto-battle state, but gave him increased damage and dex for 20 turns. Now, I have actually reduced the duration. It was 30 turns, it's now 20, and the reason why is because Grudge was useless. Plus 10 turns to Rage duration. When it's already 30 turns, you don't need that. 30 turns is plenty. But now with Grudge, you actually have a useful skill here. Ferocity is also really useful as well, but it actually gives you... It's more of a choice now. It's not an obvious, oh yes, I definitely want damage. Well, duration actually can be helpful as well now. I really didn't change much for Brutus's center trees or his left trees, though. Pretty much everything is the same here. I don't think I've actually changed anything for his left and right trees, but I completely revised his right tree. So Brutus's far right tree used to be his pyro tree, where he would light himself on fire and gain buffs for doing so. One of them would be that he would actually gain resistances to burn damage, which means that he's less likely to be afflicted by that particular status. It gave him immunity to freeze status, and it gave him a couple other unique abilities that I thought were pretty cool, one of which giving him fire element on any weapon as long as he himself was on fire. The problem with the pyro tree is it's a very late game tree. You don't want to be lighting yourself on fire early on in the game. That's pretty much a recipe for disaster. Now, there were ways that it could synergize nicely with things like Numb, where if you use Rage while you're below a third of your health, you would fully restore your health. But it still didn't feel like a tree that, even in my own playtesting, even in some later game modes, I didn't really make great use of the tree. It felt more supplementary. It didn't feel interesting enough to exist on its own. So I removed that entire tree, and now his far right tree has been replaced with something different now. So he still has Rage, but now he has another action skill, Battle Cry. Battle Cry is similar to Shine and Poison, where it inflicts non-elemental damage, and is based on the damage side of the user's weapon, has perfect accuracy, and ignores defenses. However, Battle Cry damages all enemies. So instead of just targeting one enemy, it targets every enemy, and the damage that would be dealt to a single enemy is split amongst all targets. So his normal attack does 240, 250 damage. You could expect Battle Cry to do about that much, maybe a little more if it's ignoring defense, to a single target. But against all three targets, the damage is split, and now it's about 90, 70, 80, kind of splits the damage and averages it out among the targets. So that is Battle Cry. It is now, Brutus is the only character who this early in the game, literally level 1, has a target all ability. It may not necessarily be the strongest thing in the world yet, but it can be expanded, and that is now the focus of his right tree. So I've replaced every single skill. There are a few just kind of passive abilities, such as this one here, which gives him increased targeting priority, so enemies will target him more. But now we also have things like Forceful, just straight up increases the damage of Battle Cry. Now it's only 20% as compared to the 40% increase that Shine or Poison gets, but that's because it's just a straight 20% increase. There's no extra conditions around that. I have given it an ability to cause knockbacks, so if enemies do not have full ATB gauges and they get hit with Battle Cry, their ATB gauges will be reduced by 50%, delaying their action. So aside from Intimidate, we also have Deflection. While it's on cooldown, he'll gain additional Thorns damage. I wanted to keep some Thorns options so that you can actually do a Thorns build. Now, this is where I feel like I made him a little bit too overpowered, though. His center skill is now Rally. Using Battle Cry will grant increased damage and dex to all allies. Now, it's only 10%, but this is just the beginning. But what this does is it takes Brutus and turns him into a heavy hitter, a tank, and now also team support. So if I use Battle Cry, doesn't really do anything on its own, but if I'm in a group with a party, everyone will get that status ailment next to their names. And now for the duration that Battle Cry is on cooldown, essentially, for 15 turns, everyone will get 10% bonus damage and dexterity, allowing their ATB gauges to fill up faster. On its own, not amazing. But let's look a little bit further down. The next skill down, Phalanx. When an ally under the effects of Rally takes damage, the damage is split amongst all allies affected by Rally. So for example, if I use Battle Cry and Lionel and Damien are now rallied, if Lionel takes damage, both Damien and Lionel will take half the amount of damage, so it splits the damage amongst everyone affected by Rally. That's where it gets pretty useful. But then when you go one skill further down, grants the effects of Rally to the user of Battle Cry. So now, not only are Lionel and Damien affected by Rally, but so is Brutus. and all 3 of them will now share all damage dealt to them. It splits the damage evenly amongst the 3 of them. In addition to that, Brutus also gets that 10% damage and dex bonus. And there are a few other things we can look at here as well. So that gives him some pretty good team support and actually makes him into a bit of a tank build. We also have Chilling. Battlecry can inflict freeze status. Freeze status reduces the dexterity of foes as well as their damage, so it basically slows them down. Now, on its own, that's not really great, but when you consider that this can target every single enemy at once, it gets to be a little bit disgusting. And then Grit. This used to be a skill in his Pyro tree. It has now been changed to, instead of while he's on fire, it's while Battlecry is on cooldown. So when he uses Battlecry and it is on cooldown, he gets a chance to ignore all incoming damage from enemies. So if an enemy attacks him while Battlecry is on cooldown, he has a 5% chance to just ignore that damage entirely. In addition to that, now it doesn't work for burn status because that's not external damage, that's considered internal damage. But this kind of works nicely with things like Taunt or Trouble that increases the chance that an enemy will actually target Brutus. And then finally, his Capstone ability reduces the damage penalty of Battlecry for hitting multiple enemies. So essentially, let's say you're facing 3 enemies, it will only treat the damage penalty as though you're facing 2. It will still deal damage to all enemies, but it's not going to spread the damage as though there's 3 enemies, it's going to spread it as though there's 2. If you're facing 6 enemies, it'll spread it as though there's 4. It basically treats it as though there's only 2/3 the enemies on screen as there actually are. So that, I think, gives Brutus a few more combat options, especially I think he was the worst offender with Rage putting him to an auto-battle state. That, frankly, is boring. Having a character that you cannot control is not fun. It maybe makes the game a little bit simpler for somebody who is still trying to keep up and learn the systems, but it's not fun. And there's things that do make Rage very fun, but when your actions boil down to attack, a weapon skill, cover, item, or lose control of that character entirely, that kind of sucks. Now, his Fury tree does open up some, unique kind of combinations you can do with building up stacks of damage percentage with combining your weapon skills and your normal attacks to get perfect accuracy. But that's late game stuff. This gives him something that he can do right off the bat, makes him much more viable of a character, and it actually does give him more offensive combat options. It also gives him a uniquely useful ability that allows him to target all enemies right from level 1. Nobody else can do that. So I feel like every character has been more fleshed out. They've been given their own personality a little bit more in terms of what they actually can do for the party, as well as independently. And I feel like this is going to be a good way to help the player kind of get a sense of what each player does before you end up having to get rid of one, so that you actually do get a sense of what you're missing out on, which I think will help increase the replayability and just give more options as to, what you can do throughout the game. So, those are some of the changes that have been made to Thrall. We've done a couple of other things as well. I actually added a readable font for each of the guides as well. Now this was actually done, these are done using image files, not through text formatting, because text formatting in RPG Maker VX is incredibly slow. Image files can load almost immediately, so I've added readable fonts for each of those guides as well as some of these guides here. I've been working on converting all of them to both the stylish and readable font. So that's about it for all the changes in Thrall right now. I am back to working on this game pretty consistently, and I'm hoping that I can get onto a decent development schedule where I can have this game out by the end of 2026. I cannot guarantee that or promise that, but I am going to work hard over the remainder of 2025 and 2026 to see what I can do to get this game to the finish line. So, that'll do it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.